Hey, just before we kick off this week, if I sound a little different, it's because I've just had sinus surgery and I'm sitting here recording this with 2 tubes stuck up my nose 1 week post-surgery. But in true The Physical Performance Show fashion, the learnings must go on each week. So bear with me if you hear me talking through my nose on this episode. And by the way, you're in for a real treat today. Plus, we announce a very exciting initiative, the Physical Performance Show membership.
Hi, I'm Burt. I was head physio for my sins at British Cycling and Team Sky for over 12 years. I'm a physiotherapist, author of Bike Fit and Strength and Conditioning for Cyclists. I'm an expert, apparently, in how to set people up on bikes and cycling injury and performance. And you're listening to us on the Physical Performance Show.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by our friends Endure IQ, with former featured expert Dan Plews on Expert 213, heat acclimation and training for endurance athletes, and their excellent online long course triathlon courses. And of course, brought to you by Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. And of course, each week we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform and pursue your physical best performance. We do this across a range of different episodes, interest editions, coaches' corners, expert editions, and featured performers. And coming off last week's featured performer episode with current 2020 World Triathlon Series champion Georgia Taylor Brown, we are jumping across for an expert edition that's been arguably well overdue on all things cycling fundamentals and bike fit, with, as you heard at the top of the show, none other than Burt. Now, if you are not a cyclist per se, if you are a runner, which I know so many of you are, then do not tune out. At some point, most runners are going to get on a bicycle and wonder how they should set it up. Now, likewise, if you are a competitive short course, long course triathlete, or an elite cyclist for that matter, or a cyclist of any level, there is so much to be had from Phil's sharings in this expert edition. So stay tuned in for the many learn-ins. By way of bio, Burt was the British cycling head physiotherapist for 12 years and a consultant physiotherapist for Team Sky Cycling for 5 years. And across those years, the teams collectively accrued more than 30 Olympic gold medals, 5 Tour de France victories, and more than 100 World Championship victories. Just incredible. Phil consulted with the who's who of world cycling across that time: Bradley Wiggins, Chris Froome, Chris Hoy, and Geraint Thomas. Phil is now based in private practice and is taking his many learnings to the world of cycling now through his clinic. Phil consults with British Triathlon, and in fact, a big shout out to former featured expert Ollie Williamson, senior physiotherapist for British Triathlon, for the introduction to Burt. Phil has authored 2 very successful books, Bike Fit and Strength and Conditioning for Cyclists, is a UCI advisor on positional rules, and also sits on the Redell World Advisory Board. And during today's expert edition, Phil shares around the concept of there not being an actual ideal bike fit, but rather a bike fit window. The idea that human beings are adaptable and bikes are adjustable, the fascinating concept of micro adjusters and macro absorbers, the 3 pillars of bike fit: getting aero, comfortable/sustainable, and producing power. Phil discusses common cycling ailments, lower back pain, neck strain, numb hands and numb feet, as well as what to do for the dreaded saddle sores. There's so much in this expert edition. And heads up, Phil issues arguably the most dangerous physical challenge for the week to date. So stay tuned in for that one. So get your pen and paper ready. Here come the many learnings from Burt on all things cycling fundamentals and bike fit. Phil, Burt, we've been working on lining this one up pretty much for as long as the pandemic's been going. So I'm super excited professionally and very excited for what I know will be many learnings that the listeners of the show take away. So welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thank you, Brad. Yes, it's been a while getting this together for numerous reasons, hasn't it? Not least the worldwide pandemic.
Well, obviously at the moment you're in the UK and things are looking a little bit fragile there again. But one thing that has been happening, Phil, is there's been a boom in cycling worldwide. And I know you've given a few media commentaries around this, but what have you noticed on that department?
Well, you're absolutely right. Yeah, we noticed obviously through various lockdowns, people took to their bikes, both indoors and then outdoors were allowed. And yeah, cycling has always been a fairly recession-proof sort of industry. You know, if you look back through the ages, people will always go back to their bike and go out on it. You know, it's relatively cheap to do if you can't spend a lot of money. But yeah, we saw a massive uptick in indoor training problems, people looking for advice on that and stuff. And then everybody, I think, has thought, right, a lot of people have been holding off maybe buying that dream bike of theirs. It's been the perfect time to do it. So I know from a lot of the industry insiders, most cycling companies are looking at being 60 to 70% up month on month for the year comparison. So that's an amazing, a good bit of news amongst what is pretty much a bad set of news this year.
Phil, as per the bio, you are highly accomplished in the field of physiotherapy, cycling, bike fitting. But in terms of your journey, it's been quite some ride since you left your head role of rugby physiotherapy through the height of Team Sky, the British cycling team for 12 years. I mean, the tally there of success across that time, 30 Olympic gold medals, 5 Tour de France victories and more than 100 World Championship victories. I mean, that level of success, it must have made you dizzy.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I was just part of a team that helped achieve that. And but I always say in my career, I've been very lucky. I've jumped the ship at the right time. When I was at Sale Sharks, we won the Premiership Rugby League and then in 2006 and then moved to British Cycling just at the right time. So maybe I'm just good at getting on the right trains. But the journey with British Cycling, just absolutely, 3 Olympics, and I couldn't have asked for any more. And then, when we set up Team Sky, no British man had ever won the Tour de France. In fact, your very good rider, Cadell Evans, had just won it, that sort of time for the first Australian. And it was a hell of a journey, to go into a world that, we hadn't been successful in and achieve the things we did. And I just met some, like you, mate, you meet some great people on the way, and it's just learning from all those experiences. But I've got to say, having left it, about 2 years ago now, it's that my time in that sort of environment was done. And what I become more of an ergonomicist would probably say now. So a physiotherapist who understands the body, but in the sport of cycling, the interaction between the man and the machine is so much so. And I've got some real itches I need to scratch there, and they were to do with getting everybody cycling, So it's all great winning medals, and we went and did that and Tour de France, but if we can actually get more people riding bikes comfortably, then that can be a sea change, both environmentally, transport-wise, and health-wise. So I'm fully embedded into that these days and enjoying the journey.
What a time to be, I guess, spreading the word and disseminating the years of learnings from working with, literally the sport's greatest athletes, Brad Wiggins, Chris Froome, Geraint Thomas, Chris Hoy, cycling royalty, through to the everyday rider when there's been such a boom in cycling. So let's see, Phil, we can extract some of the many, many learnings from you. And obviously some of these have been captured in your books, Bike Fit and Strength and Conditioning for Cyclists, and we'll be hooking all that up in the show notes. But Phil, let's start with maybe just a little bit of understanding around, before we look at the bike fit process, the biomechanics of cycling. And I've heard you say that human beings are adaptable and bikes are adjustable. So we'll talk about adjusting the bike shortly. But on the human being side, I know you do off-bike assessments. What sort of things do we need to consider there? And how does someone actually get a bike down the road in terms of what happens with muscle groups, etc.?
Okay, so when I came to this, Brad, cycling, it took me a while to realise that cycling is quite different to the sort of running, changing directions. With cycling, the main thing is that you're sitting, basically. So it's very important that you get a good setup. There's a postural imposition of the bike. And that postural imposition basically means that you are cycling you're sitting there for a long period of time. So that's why when I say the person's adaptable, you can jump on, anybody can jump on any bike, and you can adapt. Some people can adapt to it better than others. But say you've got a big injury history, some inflexibilities, lack of strength in certain places, your ability to adapt that to position may be much less than someone else. So that's where we have to sort of work out whether we have to bring the bike to you or you have to move to the bike. Definitely at the very high performance end, there's a lot of, if you've got a very aerodynamic position that is going to win you a gold medal, then you have to just ride that, so you'll put a lot of effort into making the athlete be able to adapt to it. But there are some key things that you can manipulate and adjust around position that help people out to meet them. So I think in my experience, Brad, when you first start out cycling, it can be a bit painful at the beginning because it's sitting for a long period of time on something that maybe you haven't done before. But over time, you develop the strength to hold the position and get better. And so people go through a bit of an evolution in cycling between starting and cycling more. And then it'd be no surprise to you that some of the most famous cyclists in the world have saddle sores and problems like that. But that's because they're riding, over 50K a year on a bike.
Yeah. So the bike to you or you to the bike. And Phil, in terms of, the muscle groups typically employed in cycling, I was quite fascinated when I heard you sharing around the fact that the power generation really comes from above the knee, but below the knee, it's more just transferring force.
Yeah, and sorry, Brad, picking up on that. Yeah, you're right. We'll go through the body there, and the weird where we learn that from is from our paracyclists who have below knee amputation guys. They're the best transfers of power. So I was lucky to work with a great team of people, and the biomechanist at British Cycling was a fantastic guy and brilliant at what you call inverse dynamics, and working out where the which joints and which muscle groups are really contributing the power. And it's produced quite a lot of outstanding research. And really, cycling all comes from your hip, so your glute, and then your thigh, so your quad. Your quad and your glutes are responsible for generating your power, and then your lower leg, your calf, foot, and ankle is responsible for transferring that power. And you think about it, we're in a hard carbon fiber shoe, attached to a metal pedal. So you can see how important that foot interaction at that point, having a good fitting cycling shoe that can help you stop your foot moving around inside the shoe too much, transferring that power. It can lose power below the knee, but you don't really generate it, and that's where the prioritization comes in terms of bike fit process for me, which we'll come into later, is that the engine room, which is where you sit and how you pedal, is the most important thing first and foremost. The rest falls around it really, and then they all work together. But at one point, I'll give you, Brad, maybe you don't know about this, but interestingly, I used to work with a doctor at British Cycling. He used to hate people talking about core for cyclists. It was a really good thing, is that you are in, for example, people who may struggle with core stability in that, actually quite a lot of them are very, very good at it. It's a completely different action. Your hands are fixed, you're sitting, your feet are locked into something. So some people who struggle maybe with the high skill, high effort sports in terms of turning direction and stuff on high skill execution can sometimes do very well at cycling. And one of the tests we often say is can you cycle with no hands? Because if you can do that, you probably got all the core you need to be good at cycling.
Interesting. And what was the doctor's reticence of people talking about core strength or core stability, if you like?
Well, a typical doctor, mate. He was just. Well, having said that, the hardest question I was ever asked, Brad, was in my interview for my job at British Cycling by the sadly now passed away Neil Black. It was he asked me, "So, can you define core stability for me?" And I think that's the hardest question I've ever been asked.
What was your answer?
It was like, I said, I think it's a much. This was back in 2006, so maybe things have moved on, and people may disagree with me, but I said I think it's a much used but poorly misunderstood term, and it does seem this golden phrase, isn't it? That's an umbrella term for anything you really want to put underneath it. But if you actually think about it, I can't really define core. It's just hard.
Yeah, it's I think you did very well in answering it. But one thing you did point out just before there, Phil, was that you need the strength to hold the position, and that just implies that cyclists of any level, beginner through to elite, there's things that they can be doing off the bike to assist their on-bike, I guess, comfort, positioning, and obviously their performance, strength and conditioning.
Absolutely. That's what the second book was about, with the best strength and conditioner I ever worked with, which was Martin Evans. He's now at the FA with the England football team. But, we took the attitude, cycling for a long time, if you look at pro cyclists, you look at the end of the old Grand Tours, they became so molded to the one function of riding the bike that they looked like you could blow them over when they stood up, And if you ever want to do that, just YouTube pro cyclists fighting. It's the most funniest thing you'll ever see. They can't stand on two legs. But a lot of and you know what? One of the key guides of that, if you embrace the off bike but it has to be tailored into what is the goal on the bike. And I think a great example of that is that Bradley Wiggins winning the time trial road world championships back in, I think, 2014, something like that. He committed to a 16-week pure strength off-bike training program. It was pure strength off the bike, but he was still riding the bike, obviously. But it was completely geared towards winning that championship where he had to go up against the guy who won it the last few years, Tony Martin, the German. And we knew he had to hit a certain power of that course, sustained, to beat him. But that strength couldn't come from just cycling. And he's a wealthy man these days. He could commit. He put the actual gym that we have in British cycling in his house, so he could do that. So he moved one of the barriers to most people doing gym work sometimes, isn't it? He's actually just getting to the gym. But he committed to that. And when I first met Bradley, he was like a stick insect and really was a poorly put together, you would say, athlete. He was amazing on a bike, but off it. But then there's an example of somebody committing to that. And so I do think a lot of cyclists can get a lot out of off the bike work. It just needs to be well planned and well structured, so that you're getting your bang for your buck. You don't want to be spending, hours doing stuff that doesn't really contribute to whatever your goal is on the bike.
And I guess it's about improving your physical tissue capabilities that then should translate over to not just hopefully a better performance through power generation, but also a better ability to deal with training loads.
Exactly, completely right. And I know that is your mantra, but I kind of like, I see it as like filling up the tank with more petrol, as it were, or you imagine like a base of support. If you're building a pyramid, you want the widest base you possibly, so we can get the highest pyramid you can, the top of the pyramid being your ultimate performance and not breaking down, like you say, for injury or illness. So I think that kind of work, if you can chuck it in, it just makes your base nice and big and solid, doesn't it? And then you can build up. But you don't want to be building a house of cards, do you?
Look, that's a great analogy. Phil, we're talking about this concept of bike to you or you to the bike, and this is the you to the bike stuff. Before we do talk about bike to you, on the you to the bike stuff, Phil, what are some of the measures or anthropometrics that people need to be aware of that will help them either ride faster, i.e. more aerodynamically, or more comfortably? So what are the areas you see where people often lack? And I've heard you note, Phil, that it's so driven by what we do in our day. So can you give a few pointers around areas of typical concern?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people don't think about what you've probably heard me mention a few times already, the goal of what they're doing. So a lot of people come into our clinic and they have a bike set up for which Mark Cavendish would be quite proud of riding. But if you're a desk jockey sitting there all day, and we are a reflection of what we do. And I have a theory actually that most of us, what most people I see set up their position based upon, I think as human beings, we've become very good at sitting, haven't we? And poor lumbar flexibility. And a lot of bike positions just reflect that, So if you're a desk jockey most of the year, your position, I always talk about a bike fit window, not there is no one ideal position, because if me and you go for a 2-week training camp on the Queensland coast now, just ride our bikes every day and do all the other stuff around that to make ourselves more flexible, our ideal position is very different to when we start out after 4 weeks in solid in the office with the boss breathing down our neck. So there's a dynamism there. But some of the metrics I see most people is just trying to I think Aero is really, really important in cycling, and we'll dive into that more because it's just free speed once you're above a certain speed, and so it's very important. The problem is that the the bike industry really sells the aero thing, but my criticism of most people is unless you're pedaling fast and hard first of all, then you can't go any faster. So it's first and foremost, I think most people don't get into their most powerful pedaling position, and that can be sometimes due to lack of strength in holding that position, but quite often it's due to a few parameters that maybe we can talk about how their bike's set up that is stopping them achieving that, and often a reflection of what they're doing the rest of their life, So if I had one thing, I'd sort of say to everyone, I wouldn't worry about aero first and foremost. Normally, for me, the low-hanging fruit is more, and most people is, right, are you able to pedal in the most effective way as hard as you can? And if you can't, why not? And let's move that first of all, because quite often it leads to a more aero position, because it nearly always ends up with lifting your saddle forward, so your front drops down. But that's the main thing. And there's a few tips we can give to your listeners as we go through.
Yeah, no, fantastic, and let's do that. And just before we do look at the bike to you, the bike fit type process, just a couple of other principles I've heard you cite, Phil. Micro absorbers versus macro adjusters. So we're talking about you to the bike. What do those terms mean?
Just a small correction there, Brad. It's micro adjusters versus macro absorbers.
Sorry,
but it's okay, because I think you've probably seen that. I think people misprint it quite often anyway. Now, so that came, and you've worked with some great sports people, and for that, when I signed up to write the book Bike Fit, because when I came to cycling, I was like, okay, so this bike setup process seems pretty important, because people were coming in with injuries that having changed their shoes or pedals or position, and where's our manual on this? And there wasn't one. So the only reason I wrote a book on Bike Fit was I couldn't find anything in the world on it, and that's why we did it. So when I sat down to do it, I was like, first and foremost, I did it in, never do a home Olympics, have your second child and try to write a book. That was a bad move in 2012. But in trying to do it, I suddenly realized that it was a very hard subject to write about, because you change one thing, you change everything. But then I also noticed that bike fit's really, really important to some people, like incredibly important. So I'll give you an example that, Eddie Merckx used to go out, one of the great cyclists ever, with an Allen key in his back pocket, and he would change his saddle position, both fore, aft, tilt, or up and down, by millimeters every single day of his career. And I know cyclists like that, with Ben Swift, who doesn't mind me saying this. He's a micro adjuster. He's a person I noticed that small changes, and people can reflect upon this, and you probably do notice it, Brad, in the population of athletes you look after, but maybe listeners apart from cycling might recognize this, is that some of us, when we're growing up, we know if your slightest thing goes wrong, like the trainer becomes ever so slightly deformed in a place, or the training plan doesn't go quite, or they miss a massage. Small things make big differences to certain people. Whereas, when we're growing up in school, and there's that kid who's just good at everything and every sport and just seemed to be able to adapt to everything. So my reflection was that through looking after the athletes, both off the bike and being involved in their setup eventually, and the ergonomics, was that some people are macro absorbers. And I'd say the first one of those is Geraint Thomas, who just recently, fractured his hip, but managed to finish one stage of the year with a fractured hip, pulled out the next day, but he rode 155k and up Mount Etna with a broken hip. And he's my example of a macro absorber, because I know he rode half the stage of a Tour de France once on the wrong spare bike, but he didn't even notice. But Geraint's like that. I looked at it, he's won the Tour de France, but he's a guy, you can set him a training plan and he just absorbs it, just adapts to it. So he's my macro absorber. And obviously bike fit, whilst he might not be in the most optimal position, he isn't going to break him. Whereas Ben Swift would come in once, 4 Pinarello Dogma bikes. That saddle height is wrong. Mechanics said it wasn't. We measured it with our digital retool kit, which is accurate within 2 millimeters, 4 or 5 times. Saddle heights are all the same. Friday afternoon, I really wanted to go home, Brad, and I just leant on the bike that was apparently the offending one. That he said that saddle height's not right, it's too high. I just noticed that the saddle was firm. I said, "Is this a new saddle, Ben?" He goes, "Yeah." And for him, P and the Princess sort of thing, the fact that the new saddle was there, that meant that the saddle height felt wrong and too hard. So you can see the difference in this. I think we can all recognise in ourselves, elements of those things. If you just be honest with yourself and say, are you a sort of person, if everything's not lined up, things will, your Achilles starts getting sore or something like that, or are you one of those people who, stretching, that's not for me. It's just getting on with it. So that's where the whole micro adjuster, macro absorber, and it seems to have gone down really well. A lot of people sort of seem to use it, but it was just my real honest reflection of why. And I think that's we as physios, Brad. Some people you look after, you are a major part of their success, because without you, they wouldn't have ever been able to do what they wanted to do. And I got to be honest, though, some people I looked after, I hardly ever saw them and still went out and won loads of medals. So it's just, unfortunately, what God gives us, maybe.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, and you got to wonder how much is physiological versus psychological, but it's the entire person, right?
Oh, I think the I mean, the greatest man I ever worked with in terms of contribution to success of British cycling, and even Sir Dave Brailsford said this as he left the building. So I think you'll miss Steve Peters, who was our psychiatrist, more than him, because I couldn't agree more. My second sort of what would you call it, insight would be that the people who win, there's so many people who have the numbers, aren't there, Brad, or the physiology, or the ability to be at the top, but why do some people do it multiple times and all the time? And I think it is that last bit is definitely psychological,
Brilliant. Phil, let's go to taking the bike to the rider. So we're talking bike fit here, and we're remembering this concept that you've coined: human beings are adaptable and bikes are adjustable. So now, anyone that's ever jumped on a bike, recreational to elite, knows that there's lots of things that you can change. And I guess I've heard you talk about these 3 pillars of bike fit. Could you maybe touch on those first? And obviously we're not forgetting, as you've said, Phil, that this is all coming back to an athlete's goal.
Yeah, and so the 3 pillars of fit really looks at that. You take into the athlete's goal, and then the 3 pillars of fit really fit around that. So, and if you can imagine, so winning team pursuit is an incredibly aero position that you only have to hold for 4 minutes. So if you can imagine the pillars for aerodynamics and power are massive. And then the one about comfort or sustainability, as I was told to call it by Dave Russell, because he doesn't pay riders millions of pounds to be comfortable. But this concept is comfort, sustainability really goes down because it's not that long, so you can probably suffer it. Compare that to somebody who's trying to ride around the world or wants just to go for really long, comfortable rides at the weekend. Some power reduction is important. Air is not really important at all. And comfort, sustainability is everything, And it's the interplay between those ones, so you can have a really aero position, but if you can't hold it for longer than 5 minutes and your event is, say 5 hours in an Ironman, then that's not going to be great because you're not going to hold the aero position. So it's interplaying between those and realizing which ones are getting that almost like, it's like looking at, the old, when we used to have MIDI hi-fis and you see like those spectrum of the noise going up and down. Imagine interplaying those and getting the perfect balance between them. That's the sort of, and you're absolutely right. The thing about a bike is that there are so many things to adjust. And the second thing is, as soon as you move one, you change the interrelationship between them all. So it can be very confusing, for people. Yeah,
but let's not forget those 3 pillars, because I think that just so intuitively makes sense. You've got to consider the aerodynamics, the power, and then the comfort / sustainability. And you really probably can't have your cake and eat them all, right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So if you're going to be in the most, best aero position, that's going to come at a bit of a cost, So it probably will hurt, and might not be sustainable for that long, So yeah, you can't have all 3 of those just maximal, and if you do, then there's going to be consequences. So yeah, getting the interplay and balance right. And again, our process is, and people can follow this themselves, is, well, what is my goal, and if it's, for example, I need to do this much a cycle for this long, and I would say if that's anything over an hour to 2 hours, then aero really starts to come out of that. Of course, being more aerodynamic means you get round the course quicker. So there's that counter argument, but really, I think the body will fail before the bike does. So, and it's balancing those things. Of course, looking at the person, as well. The interesting thing is in the middle of in cycling is that you got the machine, as you say, which is adjustable, and that's infinite on a spectrum, but the person is only finitely adjustable or adaptable. So, but human beings, as wonderful as they are, they're the complicated things that are inherently all different.
Yeah. I guess, Phil, whenever anyone hears bike fit, probably the first thing an athlete will think about is saddle height. So, as you said, if you move one thing, you affect the other. So, what are some key considerations around, obviously this is a common question you'd get every day of the week, but around finding an athlete's, a cyclist, triathlete, is ideal saddle height. And I know, as you say, there's a window, not an ideal necessarily pinpointed height, but how does a cyclist find that ideal window or position?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for the purposes of what we're doing today, is to enable people maybe to understand that and do that themselves. Obviously, there's bike sizing, and then there's bike fitting, and there's different levels of bike fitting, and we do that with some amazing technology that makes us understand where your window of bike fit window is, and that's to do with basically it's how far you extend the knee. You don't want it too far because then you get pain at the back of the knee and you lose power. You don't want it too low because that will cause you knee pain, again, loss of power and different things. And the ideal range is roughly around about, the way the retool measures it, between 35 and 40 degrees, but of the knee extension, and that is the key parameter. But people can work that out themselves with some of the really useful rules of thumb. I think 75% of people get 75% of the way there by using something like that, which is just using anthropology. So that'll be, you can use websites looking at your height, and that'll tell you roughly what your saddle height would be. Or the classic one is inseam height, so how your inseam inside leg measurement basically times by 0.883, I think it is. They call it the Numb method, and that'll spit out a good guide to what your saddle height will be. But what I notice is that some people, that method will work really well. But for example, if you've got poor flexibility, or you're one of those people with long legs, short back, it can lead to some other issues. But you know what? For the large majority of people, that'll get them a good way to where they should be. And in my practice, since coming out of working with elites, who obviously all have pretty good positions by the very fact that they're competing at an elite level of cycling, it's a de facto thing. But in the ordinary population, which I actually enjoy working with immensely now, because making someone 2% better is great for winning medals, but making someone 25% better and enabling them to enjoy their sport is really rewarding. But a lot of thing I notice is most people sit too low, if you ask me, and normally too far back. And it's just my observation, but nearly always people have a bit of ability to move their saddle height higher and further forward. And my reasoning for that, Brad, is that I think most of us are better at sitting down these days, and we're more skilled at that than we are maybe. And what you really want for a good saddle height is good saddle height, and the saddle far forward will get you up and above the pedals or the bottom bracket, and therefore will bring you more glute. So your more powerful, effective saddle position is higher and further forward. And my analogy to explain that is that, if you look at track sprinters like Chris Hoy and some of the great Aussie ones as well, Glayton, that you look at those guys are really high on the saddle far forward, and that's the most powerful cycling, maximal cycling. So that's generally the trend, I would say, that most people, if you use those sort of rules of thumb to set you up, but normally people sit a little bit low and too far back. Of course, if you move your saddle up and forward, you have to have a bit more strength to hold it on the front of the bike. So that might be the limiting factor for some people. But you know what? If you can try it out and you can start to build that, strength into the upper body by actually riding the position, then you probably get there in the end.
And what are some of the signs, Phil, of a rider being too low or too far back? I mean, what sort of things might a rider notice? So
normally being too low and too far back, well, basically it's a bit like being in a gym and doing lunges too far forward. What you being too low, you flex the knee more, and therefore you end up with more patellofemoral compression. So front of the knee pain, if you're getting that's a good sign that you probably are sitting a little bit too low. It's really counterintuitive, to put your saddle up and forward. I think that's going to be easier because it feels like it's going to be harder. But believe you me, it often will sort out a lot of people's problems. Too far back will be, maybe getting quite a lot of low back pain, because basically your hip will be really closed up depending on what your crank length is. But a lot of people think about pulling up in cycling, and that's a myth we should talk about right now and disclose that in cycling, our hip flexor, our psoas muscle, is a relatively small muscle, and it doesn't really pull up in cycling, because on the other leg that's pushing down on the other side has the two biggest, powerfulest muscles in the body, the quad and the glute. So it really is. It's not that important in terms of your pedaling, the hip flexor. But what is important is that it sits in inner range hip flexion, which means, if me and you jumped in an very old Mini Cooper car and drove halfway across Australia, we wouldn't be surprised to get out of that car and have stiff backs. And that's because the hip flexor, your hip flexor is dead tight, it hasn't released off, and it's pulling your lower lumbar back into real extension, So that's one of the common signs of sitting too low and too far back.
And just to recap there and reiterate, pulling up in cycling is a myth with the pedal stroke.
I'll be taken to the cleaners by some people, but as somebody who has tried with biomechanists and physiologists to make some very good athletes change the way they pedal, it's really hard to do. It's like, if you think about it, anything that's happening at 90 to 100 times a minute, and you telling me to think about it, I don't think this is. I think what I do know is you'll have far more joy and success and bang for your buck in changing either your strength or flexibility or maybe the environment that you work in. So if you change the environment, it's basically changing the bike setup will help you pedal much more better than potentially trying to cognitively tell yourself to do something. That's happening so quickly. I don't think there's really a choice in that. I think the body sets itself up and goes, right, we're pedaling. This is how we do it. And we to get you up, Brad, we're not born with the ability to pedal. We're born with the ability and the intuition to walk, gait, and we walk on bikes. That's what we do. So we transfer the CPU that is walking and we put it onto a bike, and we work out how to make that pedal the bike, but we haven't got this inbuilt pedaling hard drive in the back of our brains.
So it's true, cyclists really do dance on pedals.
Yeah. I'm having that one. That's a good one.
So Phil, you mentioned a common flaw is being too low, too far back. It's about getting up if you can and forward over the bottom bracket to engage the glutes and in the quads for more power.
Yeah.
But the flip side of being too low would be being too high. Any signs for someone that they might be too high? What might they be experiencing? I mean, I know over the years, if I've gone too high, it just doesn't feel effective. I feel like I can't drive the pedals.
Exactly.
I've heard you say that, Phil. Feeling's important.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, often in our process, surrounded by lots of objective data, but I really think we have to listen to the subjective, which is normally your feeling. And often I put a lot of store and energy, and we ask for feedback from our people who come through our process, a few weeks down the line. Not really bothered about the numbers in the end. The numbers tell us where we want to go, but which direction. But it's how you feel, And you're absolutely right. So, classic thing for feeling too high, and I think what you would have been experiencing there, Brad, is you just sort of lose the pedal towards the end of the stroke because it's gone. It's in the air almost. You're waiting for it to come back towards you, and that's your knee extension's too high. The other thing you might have experienced there is then rocking, on the saddle. So you're rocking from side to side to try and make the legs and the feet reach the pedals, and too high. Often some back of the knee pain, definitely. Often it's most common in time trialists and the time trial position, and often you'll get glute pain as well. Get almost like glute tendinopathy type issues. And they're the classics of being too high. As I said, though, for most people, more common than I find, and I'm not saying it's far more common to be too low and too far back than it is being too high. But if you are suspecting you're too high, it's normally losing the pedal at the bottom of the pedal stroke or losing power, and then rocking and maybe a bit of almost like sciatic type pain down the back of the leg.
Phil, we want to talk. It's an area I know you've got a lot of to offer in here. Is about crank length. So I mean, it's a common misconception that I picked up from listening to your work that I was always taught as a junior that the bigger the crank, the more force you could generate. But in listening to yourself, I learnt that it's not about an increase in force necessarily. It's more about just changing your gear in because you'll have a different circle. So can you take us through the crank length and why that may be important for cyclists to consider or is important? Yeah,
a really good point, Brad, because I think it's really important for performance and comfort. And you're absolutely right. When back in the day, everyone said, if you'd be on a bigger, longer crank, everyone says, but I think the theory was bigger crank, you could generate more torque, generate more power. Generally, the taller you were, you're on a longer crank. So Wiggins used to be on 177.5, and you buy a certain size bike and it comes with a certain size crank. So it assumes that if you're bigger, you need that bigger crank. Luckily, Paul Barrett, who's the guy who used to live next door to me at British Cycling, biomechanist, did his PhD in this with some other guys. And it is a parameter that isn't manipulated by many people on the bike. You just accept it. But basically, they proved that crank length in sub-max cycling, which is what we all do. Max cycling is team sprint cycling. So just the hardest thing you'll ever do, the highest power. In the first couple of pedal revolutions, apparently, crank length is important there. So incredibly high forces, very low cadence, huge powers, that becomes important. But in sub-max cycling, we literally have to go as low as 80 millimeter cranks, which you'll never see, or 320 to see a difference in power. And as you said, all it does is change our gearing. Now, given that, and I'll show you now that Bradley was riding 177.5s, and he won the Tour de France on those. But when he broke the hour record, he went down to 170. Now, the reason why he did that was by going down in crank length, you basically take top dead center of the pedal cycle away from you. So you open up the hip. So It's a bit like saying if I had a gym box here now, Brad, and I said, okay, 1 meter high gym box or 6-inch step, you can jump on one of those 100 times, all right? And I'm going to give you $100, whichever one you jump on. Which one would you choose?
Oh, the 16-inch step, Phil.
There you go. So that's crank length, because there's no cost to performance. The outcome is the same as long as you manipulate the parameters. All right, so if crank length can be changed and it doesn't cost you anything in terms of performance, just changes your gearing. And for example, you want to get in a more aero position, but you feel like you're eating your kneecaps, or your thigh. Often in these time trial positions, I know you're a triathlete, because common thing you see is the wrong crank length on what is quite a good position, but you're really fighting it to try and get there. So the hip coming really close to the chest, that affects your ability to diaphragmatically breathe, take your stomach down. The knees are getting close to the arm pads at the front. Your hips losing, your glutes waiting for the pedal to come over the top dead cycle before it can start to extend and engage and, and meaningfully contribute to the pedal cycle. So I really am a big advocate for changing crank length, and we've had success with it, quite a lot of really good athletes. But I would say I've had more success with it in sorting out people's problems, So as we do get older, we do all start to become a bit less adaptable, a bit less flexible. And if you've got a bit of hip pain or knee pain, if you can make the kinematic challenge of cycling smaller, easier, i.e. the circle you have to pedal is smaller, but you just do it faster. Brilliant. One thing we know as physios, mate, is if we can make the task easier for people, it's much easier than making them better, isn't it?
Oh, it's fascinating, and I think that myth's probably been pervasive for so many years about it's all about the power, where in reality it isn't, outside of the maximal cycling that you referenced there. And I've written down there it's about reducing the kinematic challenge, particularly in people that may have knee pain or hip pain. But you said this there, Phil, at the start. If you adjust one thing, you need to be considerate of what that then means to the next thing. So I've heard you say that if you do go to a shorter length crank, obviously you need to put your seat up a bit.
Yeah, and that's so crank length's a real hard one to understand about what to change about your saddle height, because obviously the top of the pedal cycle just got further away and the bottom got closer. But I would so if you're a performance athlete, we normally go for what we'll adjust it so we get it for the most powerful point in your pedaling cycle, which might be between about 9 o'clock and 12 o'clock, forward at the foot as you're coming towards bottom dead center, just from a 9 o'clock position. But I would say much easier to understand is just put your saddle up the same amount as you drop your crank length, because I'd far rather have the hip more open at the top and maintain your good saddle height position, for generating power, So basically, as you say, the one thing, of course, when you put your saddle up, just to link in even further again, and what people are quite often do, unless you're on a time trial bike with an inline seat post, when you put your saddle up, it moves backwards as well, because the effective seat tube angle is on a slant. So just for your listeners, if anyone does that, looking to adjust their saddle height, to remember to, if they're comfortable where they are in terms of the saddle fore aft, how far forward it is, to remember to move the saddle forward and maintain that good position there.
Yeah, that's a great point, Phil. You've mentioned that adjusting things can obviously help conditions. I guess some of the more common complaints you often hear from cyclists are hand numbness and aggravation around the hand. What tips can you share with listeners around how to navigate that if they are getting some symptoms in their hands, numbness, pins and needles, etc.?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It is a really common complaint. And so the first thing to note is that if you cycle for hours and hours and hours and hours, it's not unusual or not uncommon to get pins and needles, So, and it may be just the fact that you've been cycling that long, So there might be nothing wrong with you, or the bike position might just be a consequence. But most people will get it a lot sooner than that, and it can be really annoying and troublesome, and the hand going on. Basically, the medial and the ulnar nerve, come through the bottom of the hand underneath the thumb, the big pad of skin there, the femur ailments, and we have so much pressure on that, then that's the distribution it normally affects, and then you get the numb hand. So it can be a sign of like you've got too much weight on the front of the bike, so it could be that your front end is too low. I definitely look at that front end being too low rather than saying saddle too high, first of all, for reasons that you can probably understand what we've just been through. And so bringing your front end up and taking some of the weight off your hands and off your upper body can really, really help with hand numbness. The common thing that most people don't realize is that handlebar width. So your handlebars should roughly be in line with your shoulders, your acromion, when you're cycling. And a lot of people wouldn't have thought of adopting their handlebar width. And too wide a handlebar can make your hand splay and go into a splay position on the hoods or the tops, and that puts even more pressure there. the third thing is that some people are just vulnerable to it, but it can be quite easily solved by things like double bar tape, taking cushioning the handlebars a bit more, or even like cycling gloves with small gel patches in them across the femur eminence, the palm of your hand. They can help some people in terms of handling that. But the most common thing you see is that they're too low at the front and they're taking too much weight, and therefore they're taking so much weight through the hand that it compresses the nerve, and that gives them the nerve pain. So backing yourself off that way can often help out. Remember that too much weight at the front, if your saddle's too far forward and tilted too far down, that'll chuck you forward as well, things like that. You can start to see how this multifactorial picture builds up around bike fit, but hopefully that will help some people out.
And the angle of the hoods, Phil, any tips there?
Yeah, I feel the old school way of, if you I don't know if this is the case in Australia, but the old school way was like hoods always rotated all the way down, so people were dumping into loads of like wrist wrist deviation to get there. I'm Shimano and SRAM and all the other ones. The cycling hood is a beautiful. Apparently, Shimano took 5 years to ergonomic design. It's got 16 different hand position, and most people can't. The thing about the angle is that I reckon it's a little bit better with the hood ever so slightly rotated upwards, because you can meet it neutral with your wrist, and that to me is how they should be used. A lot of real pros and race riders always like them dead flat, but that's fine if you can cope with it. The more common thing, Brad, I see with that is that you get people getting numb hands because they can't get to the hood. So real annoying thing you see in the clinic is they come in, there's that beautiful Dura Shimano hood at God knows how much money, and all their bar tape's worn behind it because the standard. So that's a factor of reach and whether they've got too long a front end cockpit stem or they're sitting too far back. It won't surprise you, relates to sitting too far back more, in my opinion, because that's what I often see. And often we have guys come in, as you say, numb hands, and they think the bike's too big for them. And all it is their saddle's so far back they're virtually sitting in the car park trying to ride it. And you move the saddle forward and up, and they feel great. And they're just like, oh my God, this is so much better. And so, if you've got that hoods on your bike, make sure you're using them. And if you're not using them, why aren't you using them? Is it why can't you get there? Try and think about that, So again, I ramble on, sorry.
No, that's brilliant. Some great tips there, Phil. And I think most cyclists, or if not all cyclists, will have experienced those symptoms at some point. Phil, two more sort of bike fit areas that are so topical, and I know you've got so much great stuff to share around, would be cleats. I recently changed from the same pair of shoes after many years with the cleats, and the shoes split apart, so they got turfed in the bin, and the cleats made their way onto a new pair of shoes. And a week or two later, I had bilateral kneecap pain. So perhaps I'm a micro adjuster. Is that right? Micro adjuster. But Phil, where do we position the cleat on the shoe, and what sort of things are we looking for? Is it just the intuition around what feels good?
Yeah, I think if you can't, so to give you some advice there, Brad, first and foremost would be I would always keep hold of old cleats and shoes, and if you can afford it, buy new shoes and cleats, because I've had that problem many times with pros, and you go, well, where's the old setup? And they go, I've thrown it away. Because if you've got that old setup, you'd be able to compare it, you see. It's not saying you're going to have to go back and use it, but you can go, okay, got a bit of a problem, look at the setup of the shoe. And that could be so many different reasons, just like you've got the cleat in ever so slightly different position, and therefore, it's starting to pass up some more rotational forces to the knee. So therefore, you've got the problem. Cleat fore aft is really important. A real simple one for this, mate. If you're ever worried about where to put your cleats, just shove them all the way back, because what that does, it positions the foot further forward on the knee. So the old knee forward to foot measure in cycling, some people recognise it used to drop a plumb line down, when your knee's at 90 degrees in the pedal cycle. So some reason for bilateral kneecap pain nearly always is if your foot's too far forward. So with you, what I do first of all is just slam them all the way backwards. And there's no cost of performance with that. In fact, a lot of people make the argument for arch cleats, where we have these cycling. If you look at modern evolution of cycling shoes at the moment, the platform for where you put the cleat is coming further and further back, because they realise that is more and more comfortable. Generally, your cleat should be positioned so that the pedal, when you clipped in, is bisecting the line between your first metatarsal and your fifth metatarsal. So that's your big toe and your little toe, So it's bisecting there. But I would say, if you're having any problems, shove your cleats all the way backwards. Never fails in my experience. If that's the issue, it will sort it out. Of course, then you get into, you weren't changing pedal systems because you're using the same cleat, but Shimano and Look are fantastic, and if you get on with them, I'm all for them. But they are toe cleats, so toe float. So basically, you've got the ability to move your heel in and out, but it's all from one position, and therefore your cleat setup becomes really important. Some people who, for example, if you walk like a duck, very externally rotated, you recognise it, and you end up with iliotibial pain on the bike all the time, always having to foam roll, all those things. If you walk like a duck, you want to pedal like a duck. And Speed Play are a much better pedal system at allowing people to drop their heels all the way in and all the way out. Amazing story, Steve Play, built by a guy, fortunately, who's now retired, called Richard Byrne in San Diego. And he was a cyclist whose career was finished by a knee injury, and he was convinced it was because of the pedal, so he made his own pedal system. So Speed Play are as physios and bike fitters go-to pedals because they're just much more adaptable. They do different levels of spindles and so on and so forth.
Okay, Speed Play, and some great tips there. I mean, there's so much more I know, Phil, and I'm pushing you on just general principles, which I know is tough. It's always contextual to the rider in front of you. Saddle considerations. You've spoken about saddle height and setback. But what about tilt? And when it comes to things like saddle sores, I know your research and work forced a UCI rule change on saddle tilt, and also reduced female saddle injuries within the British cycling team leading into the Rio 2016 Olympics. So what can you share with the listenership, Phil, around awareness of how to reduce saddle sores, etc.?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. It's so multifactorial, but let's hoover up the easy do nots, first of all. So you're right, we did challenge the UCI. They used to have a rule that you couldn't tilt the saddle down more than 2.5 degrees, which, depending on how they measured it, on whether the floor was level or not, really forced all the riders to ride dead flat. And saddle tilt can really help a lot of people rotate your pelvis forward. So one thing for sure, so do not, is I don't know of any saddle company who designs a saddle to ride with the nose effectively up, all right? So if you nose yourselves up, don't be surprised if you're getting penile numbness or saddle sores, because you will do. So it should be level or 1 to 2 to 3 degrees down, depending on comfort. You don't want to be feeling like you're falling off the front of it, but just edging that saddle a bit higher, a bit further forward and rotate down can just cup you so much more. So a bit of a quick tour of saddles is that, if there are time trial saddles and then there are road saddles, really, road riding saddles. Now, road saddle is a T-shaped saddle, and it has 2 wide bits at the back, which you're meant to sit on, your sit bones. And if you're sitting on the front bit of it, rotating forward, that's fine if you're a pro trying to win the Tour de France, but that can sometimes produce some of these saddle issues. So if you've got a T-shaped road saddle and you're not sitting on the correct bit of it, then that can cause some issues. And of course, that's why in the world of triathlon and Ironman, split nose saddles and such as the ISM one, and there are many other varieties out there now, they really work well because in time trial position we're much more rotated forward, so we're more on our pubic rami, which is the bones at the front of your pelvis, and those pubic rami are a bit more sensitive. The clue comes in the fact that the ischial tuberosities are called sit bones because we sit on them a lot, so we're a bit more better at that, and pubic rami aren't. So that's where the support and cushioning of the split nose saddle really comes into play. Quick tip is men we have a nerve down the middle of our penis, the pudendal nerve, and that's why a lot of men will get some numbness down there in the genitalia, and that's why gap saddles were invented, and they can be really successful. Simple, if you're getting that, you just literally switch to a gap saddle, similar shape to what you have. Otherwise, that can be like overnight game changer there. Women, unfortunately, are a lot more poorly served by the cycling industry, I believe, mainly because I have to look after and find the solutions for horrendous problems within our athletes. And some women can make a gap saddle work for them, but it's not really designed for them, if you ask me. And then the other women's genitalia is very different downstairs to men. So instead of maybe 1 or 2 different presentations, women can have up to 9. And so they really have to sort of trial and error, find what works for them. Hence why chamois choice in the clothing can be so important for women, because often they're having to find a chamois that will work with the right saddle for them. And that seems a bit more important to women than men, in my experience. And chamois cream, as a general rule of thumb, any tips around who should apply it, who shouldn't? Yeah, I'm in the process of developing a new one at the moment because that's a really interesting area. So some people never use chamois cream and some people do. Now, if you think about sitting on, the reason why we get saddle sore, there's lots of different types of saddle sore. There's saddle pain, and then the saddle sores where people actually get, infections and hard red lumps and can stop you cycling, or abscesses in the end. So if you think about cycling, we sit on the bike, so you've got pressure, you've got friction with the legs moving up and down, and then you can often get quite wet down there, especially in your country, sweating. And then you've got heat, pressure, friction. And the one thing that skin does not like is all three of those together, right? And that's so often if and then you've got whether you're getting too much pressure in the wrong place with the Saltoids. But so chamois cream can be really important for certain people. And if it works for you, I would definitely say use it. The one thing I would say is get it off afterwards is the thing, because a good chamois cream should work while you're on the bike to reduce friction, so it's the emollient quality of it that is really important. So it stops the chafing, as it were. But a lot of those products that contain a lot of oils and so on and so forth that really you want to get off your skin straight after your cycling to help it recover. So my real easy tip for most people, if you ever suffer with sore sores, just get out of your Lycra, wash and get yourself dry down there. So a big top tip, and we work with some amazing woman who was a professor of vulval dermatology at Cambridge University. So this woman knows probably more than anybody else in the world about women's skin down there. And she said the propensity to wearing Lycra or activewear, to recover is a real bad thing, because it just doesn't allow any air to get to your groin. So wearing loose shorts after you cycled is probably the best thing you can do in terms of getting air to your skin and helping recover. Everybody can do that, can't they?
Yeah, or just not wearing pants at all in this COVID area, working from home.
You speak for yourself, Brad. I'm fully clothed here.
So am I, Phil. No, look, there's some really practical considerations there. There's some useful stuff. Phil, a common malady is neck strain. Any tips around how to help a cyclist overcome neck strain? Obviously, there's the bike to the cyclist and then the cyclist to the bike, but any tips there?
Yeah, you know what? The most common thing that stops people finishing the RAM or Race Across America is a thing called Schwammer's neck. They literally can't hold their head up any longer. Now, often you can see some things from extreme examples like that. So, yeah, but it is a real common complaint. Trying to look up the road. So if we look at it's nearly always because your front end is too low. All right, or your back end is too high. As I said, it's more often the front end is too low. Those things obviously go together, But I think it's the neck extension. So if me and you decide to paint the whole of your clinic now, where the ceilings, we wouldn't be surprised at the end of 4 hours of paint to have a bit of a sore neck. But people seem to be a bit surprised that if their front end's too low on their time trial or road bike, and they're having to look up the road. So you have to look up the road. So you will extend your neck to bring your eyes in line with what's coming up. And if you do that for hours and hours and and your neck's not very good at it and it's too low, then there's no surprise you get neck pain. So I think the biggest thing, and you know what, we target in terms of extreme aero positions, the stuff that you want to do off the bike. You quite rightly talk about the adaptability of the person. The thing that I find most effective in, if your position is really good aero but you're having a lot of neck pain suffering, or your road position is a great position other than the neck pain, you can try working on yourself if you don't want to move the front end up and become a little bit more upright. And the thing I would target there is the thoracic spine and the lats. Now, if your lat tightness will really pull your shoulders in and down and limit your thoracic spine and make that neck extension a lot higher. So a lot of swimmers who come into triathlon and do a lot of that, often if you work on their lat flexibility, they can feel much more comfortable on the bike. And then secondly is, of course, a lot of swimmers have pretty stiff thoracic spines, and many of us have stiff thoracic spines now because of the very nature of screen-based time working, So foam roller, peanut work for your thoracic spine is really a good, what I call magic bullet exercise for getting yourself better on the bike. Because if you get that flexibility in the thoracic spine, which of course is the base, the middle of your back is the base where you lift your head off, then it becomes much easier. It's nearly always, I would say, Brad, nothing to do with having neck pathology, having stiff neck on the bike. It's normally due to those things I talked about, either the front end being too low or stiff thoracic spine, tight lats.
And obviously that region, that middle part of the back's a stiff part, and then a cyclist goes and spends X amount of hours a week in that flex, stoop position. So it almost is intuitive that going back the other way on a foam roller would be a wise thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. And my take on that stuff is little and often. Don't have to beat yourself up, for hours and hours. But if you just incorporate into your daily routine, just think about it as ironing your back out after you've been on it. If you've been on there for 4 hours, come home, have your shower. If you can commit to 5-10 minutes on a foam roller, best thing I find you've got loads of great tips, Brad, but I always tell my clients, you've got a foam roller, put it down in front of the television, because then you look at it when you're sitting down and I go, I haven't done that again. And if you just spend a couple of minutes, it's better than nothing, And I agree with you totally. It is a stiff area. You only have to look at, again, look at pro cyclists when they're retired. They're literally like Montgomery Burns, aren't they?
You're listening to former British cycling and Team Sky physiotherapist and author Phil Burt on this an expert edition around all things cycling fundamentals and bike fit. Support for today's show comes from our great friends Endure IQ. Founded by Dr. Dan Plews, Expert Edition 213, Heat Training and Acclimation for the Endurance Athlete, Endure IQ is there for you if you're ready to step up and take control of your training and performance goals. Whether you're an athlete or coach, Endure IQ aims to empower you with the knowledge, tools, and strategies to optimize your sports performance. Endure IQ brings you excellent online courses in the practical application of low carbohydrate, high fat fueling, training fundamentals, and heat strategies. To get your online learning started, Endure IQ are gifting the Physica Performance Show listeners $25 towards their first online purchase. Simply use the code BRADBEER, BRADBEER, at the checkout. Remember, information is useful, but knowing how to use it is powerful. Endure IQ, hitting the sweet spot of performance, health, and enjoyment. Visit Endure IQ, that's IQ.com. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio's award-winning online telehealth consultations. If you are an endurance athlete struggling with joint, bone, muscle or tendon-related concerns, then rest assured no matter where you are in the world, our online 45-minute consultations are both clinically and cost-effective and are designed to help get you back to your physical best. To find out more about Pogo Physio's award-winning consultations online, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. And we're really excited to launch the Physica Performance Show's Learnings membership. It's simple. We've set up a Patreon account for anyone that wishes to enhance their learnings through access to our triannual live stream events. To date, we've featured Dr. Stephen Seiler and most recently Dr. Shona Halson, who have been globally popular amongst coaches, athletes, and practitioners. And for just $5 a month, you can jump over to Patreon, support the ongoing production of the show, and receive free access to all live stream events throughout a calendar year. It's simple. Simply jump over to Patreon and search the Physica Performance Show, pledge your support, cancel at any time, nothing changes, but we're excited to open up this opportunity if you've been really enjoying the show to support it more. Now let's jump back with this week's Expert Edition featuring former Sky Cycling and British Cycling physiotherapist Phil Burt on all things cycling fundamentals and bike fitting. Something I've always been intrigued about and quite often get asked about is the role of an insert or a foot orthosis in a cycling shoe. And prior to listening to some of your content, I was of the opinion that it maybe didn't make that much of a difference. But what are your thoughts around foot orthoses in cycling shoes? Phil, who needs them? Who should consider it? What does it do?
Well, yes. Again, I have quite strong views on this. So I couldn't agree. It took me years to find podiatrists who understood cycling, because the first thing to remember is that if you do wear orthotics or insoles off the bike or corrective ones, then they're nearly always rear foot, and that isn't going to do much for you in a cycling shoe because it's a 4-foot sport. So if you are going to use an insole, it needs to be a full-length one, if you ask me, because cycling is a 4-foot sport, very much like skiing, all right? So, but I'm actually quite pro, and the reason being is that it always really annoyed me putting a carbon fibre expensive orthotic into a carbon fiber cycling shoe. And if you think about it, in cycling, there is no heel strike toe off like running or walking. So it's a lot more simple. It's just on. So therefore, you can be actually quite aggressive with insoles if you want to be, because if you get it right, there isn't the complicated biomechanics that the foot normally has to transition through from a mobile stationary thing that you push off to mobile thing flying on the ground. So if you bear with me a second, we reverse engineer this. When we made some special shoes, custom made carbon fiber shoes for the Rio Olympics in indoor events, because they banned overshoes. So all of a sudden the shoe had to be really aero, because we couldn't put an overshoe of it to make it aero. So we made our own shoes, and I had the job of casting them. And when we cast them, everyone calls them the aero shoes, like we had the buckles underneath and stuff. Beautiful things, incredibly expensive. But when we cast them, we saw some incredible. It was an opportunity to see if you make the shoe match the rider's foot, what happens. And we saw some incredible uplifts in power just through the change in the shoe in delivery. Now, that not everyone can afford to do that, but what my working theory is around that is that if your foot is moving around loads into a cycling shoe, it comes back to what we started at the beginning. Your foot and ankle can only lose power, and if you think about it, you're pronating massively each time in the pedal stroke to meet the shoe and then deliver and transfer the power. That's just a massive waste of energy. It can also be people see a massive uplift in comfort with what I would call just a space occupying insole, so something that just takes up the space that they don't need in the cycling shoe. So it doesn't have to be corrected biomechanically. It can be just like, all right, that's where your foot wants to be, was holding in the same place. A lot of people get a condition called hot foot as well, Brad, from the insoles from cycling. And that's just from too much pressure in between the first and second metatarsal head. And again, just standard off-the-shelf insoles over not a bad arch support and a metatarsal button can massively help reduce that sort of problem. So I'm actually quite pro. I just don't think I don't know what your view of the world of podiatry is, but I've never met a darker magical science than that. It's just, there's a lot of BS, like in a lot of professions, that even ours. But I think, if in cycling, if you can get a comfort insole, it can really make a difference to your cycling comfort. Yeah, it does.
And power, that's fascinating. Phil, a few final themes. Ollie Williamson commented, obviously British triathlon colleague of yours and former featured guest, episode 239 and 240, that they were experiencing with British triathlon an increase in kneecap pain with the COVID lockdown and athletes spending more time on a stationary bike, and that the kinematics or the kinetics, the forces, the movement patterns from a stationary bike differ to an outdoors bike. Can you just share a few thoughts around that? Because I'd actually never, ever considered that.
I work with Ollie at British Triathlon, so we help them. We headed off a lot of those problems. Two things about indoor training is, one, saddle sores go up. I've seen loads of guys who've been cycling for all their lives, and then with the advent of Swift, we've seen a real change in, and the whole indoor cycling thing, Peloton. I was noticing a change in epidemiology around knee pain and saddle pain issues, Brad, even before lockdown, and then lockdown just times that by 10. So being specific to the knee pain indoors, but you're right, the bike is literally stationary. So when you're on the road, it's moving around underneath you, and people will basically, what I would term, self-optimize to that. So they move around the bike, they position their knee over and ankle over the pedal, and they might move in and out the saddle. The biggest thing for me is just actually what you do indoor cycling. It becomes a lot easier to lay down a lot of power, if that makes sense, because you're not having to control everything else. So people become one-trick ponies, and they're just driving massively with the legs in a position that's never changing. And therefore, the loading of certain muscle groups and joints becomes a lot more consistent and intense. So therefore, if anything, I always say most cyclists are only 2 steps away from having some knee pain, for any odd reason, because the knees are vulnerable joint in cycling. We sit on our hips and pelvises, foot's locked into a system, a rigid system. So the knees are one. Ironically, cycling is great for knees. What's the first thing anyone does after a knee operation? You jump on a static bike. So getting the position right, that's why it's so important for these knee pain people. So I think if you the indoor thing is just the more sustained loading all the time, and also you just don't have any of those cues to get in and out the saddle, which, if you think about it, just gives every muscle group a rest, bit of a reset. Even if it's for 5-10 seconds, you just haven't got the external stimuluses like, coming up a hill or going up to a set of lights or maneuvering or just getting out. It's just not there in indoor cycling, and you can get a lot more locked into the numbers that are in front of you. So consequently, iliotibial band will tighten up more. Sometimes, rectus femoris, they're my two key muscle groups or fascial groups that are most responsible for knee pain. So if people are getting that, and Brad, you can maybe listen to your practice, but if any cyclist has got knee pain, if you foam roll the ITB or get in there and massage it, if you're a practitioner, rectus femoris is the key one for me. It's because it's the quad that crosses the hip and knee. If you release that boy off, nearly always releases the kneecap and will make a cyclist knee pain always better. Obviously, then you've got to go hunt around for the cause, but those two things are really, really a great muscle groups to attack if you have got yourself into a situation where you've got some knee pain going on.
Some great tips there, Phil. Phil, and finally, you've been part of the British Cycling Secret Squirrel Club looking at aerodynamics in the sport, and I had to smile, and you've referenced it already about the fact that we put so much importance on what sort of bike we might ride, but it's only 10% or thereabouts of the frontal surface area, whereas the rider's the other 90%. So, and then I heard you reference about skin suits. Just any tips there, Phil, for the rider that is very much looking to be as aerodynamic as possible, which is probably pretty much most riders on the planet.
Yeah. So, I mean, what you find there is massive bike companies who put a lot of PR and advertising about aero bikes. And you're absolutely right. Most people are the bike is about anywhere between 9 and 11% of the frontal area going through, and you're about anywhere between 91 and 89% of it. So that's why skin suits work, because they wrap the really on aero thing. So a good skin suit is worth its weight in money, but good aero position is going to be really important. But I'd always say, I think more people make the mistake of getting almost too aero and then unsustainable. What I would look for if you're looking into that is earning the right to become aero. Make sure that we used to talk about, before you ever go to a wind tunnel, British Cycling, we need to introduce this just before I left, is what we call an earn the right to go there. In other words, if you didn't pass some flexibility and strength tests, then we weren't going to invest the time putting you in a wind tunnel to find a position that you're never going to be able to hold. So I think it's almost, make sure that being aero, if you're trying to adopt a position, that's very aggressive, but there's physical limitations for you doing that. I think you'll be more on-aero because you're going to shift out of it under duress so much that you'll be in the on-aero position more often than you're going to be in the aero one. So it's finding that sweet spot. So you're absolutely right. Most cyclists in the world are always looking to objectify what is the most aero position. And my big tip would be try and hoover up all the low-hanging fruit first of all. Like we talked about crank length, yourself, all those things. Have you got literally, the most important thing, Brad, for me with most aero positions, the most key factor is saddle choice. Because if you can't rotate forward effectively at the pelvis, then your back's having to do most of the flexion, which is absolutely, it kills people. So saddle choice can come down to the most important thing in having the right saddle, in terms of being able to rotate forward, being stable, being comfortable. So those things, because going to a wind tunnel, I'd really go there if anyone's considering it. And I know because I've sat in many boring sessions of that, and it is really, really. But I was really excited for Team Sky said we're going to the window, and after one day, I was this is just the driest thing on earth. Because done properly, aerodynamics is really slow, really long, and really tedious. Because to get out of the noise, as they call it, to know whether one position is better than another, you have to go baseline, position 1, baseline, position 2, baseline. And in a gold standard process, you repeat that again. And that just takes a lot of time to do that, So my advice, if anyone's ever considered an aero session, is try and work out what 2 positions you want to test, because going there and testing 10 is just not practically feasible. And if they do that, it's probably going to do them really badly. Because what do you know is a better position? You have to record that, and get out what we call the noise, which is, just you're riding slightly different in this particular wind tunnel session, to how you were before. So getting out the noise is quite hard. But yeah, if people just put on their bullshit spectacles when they're talking about when they're reading about aerodynamics, and realise that they're the biggest thing in there: skin suits, saddle choice, crank length. Hoover up those things first of all. Generally, getting lower at the front does make you more aero, but there is a point where you go too low, and then it becomes uncomfortable, unfeasible. Head pops up, things like that. So they're the things working. But you know what? Most people are a million miles away from worrying about those things. That they've got so much more to hoover up in terms of, like I say, the terminology, low-hanging fruit, the easy gains.
Yeah, so like less beers on the weekend at the barbecue.
Oh, yeah, I need to take that advice. Yeah, exactly right. Some people talk about weight on a bike, for example, Brad, and you can spend a lot of money on the latest carbon fiber crankset Durite, but just eat one less burger a week and you save yourself the money, It's true. But so I think cycling is one of those sports, both for some of your listeners who cycle it, the listeners who isn't, because there is so much kit involved in it, and we can measure a lot of things in cycling. That's the other thing. Just my little bugbear is, people get obsessed with data and power, and data is really important, and it can really, really help improve whatever you're trying to do. But there's also a lot of data that has no relevance and doesn't mean anything to me. So just to finish off with, Brad, one of my big things I hear in the clinic is that, people who are on, watt bikes or standard bikes or have power meters, and they come in and say, yeah, my power's 52% one side, 48. And I just look at them and go, and? Because one thing I know is human beings are all asymmetrical, and the one thing is all bikes are completely symmetrical normally. So I used to challenge the biomechanists at BC on what is a significant left-right difference. What was something that we would think, well, hold on, we've noticed that we need to do something about it, and it was literally, it needs to be 10% difference between both sides, for it to be biomechanically significant and important. So it's no surprise you pedal harder with one leg, and I hate this sort of, I don't know where it comes from, this mantra of like, you need to be equal. Why? Because a lot of people get that thing, and I end up in another sport. But do you remember our really good runner? What was her name? Paula Radcliffe. Yes. Do you remember Paula Radcliffe? Do you remember she used to run with her head bobbing around everywhere, didn't she? She looked like one of those dogs in the back of a car. Her head going everywhere. And I know this story is true, that they said, I think she was winning world record times, winning medals, and someone got hold of her and said, look, imagine how much faster you go if you kept your head still. And they tried to do that, and she went slower and slower and slower.
Wow.
And, and it took someone, I think our coach put her hand on and said, run whichever way you want to run. And I often get some comments about Chris Froome's bike position, because one of his elbows sticks out. You kind of think, all right, yeah. It's really, really harming him in that, isn't it? He's won 5 to 4 It's just, you have to sometimes go, well, look, you are what you are, and it is what it is. And I don't think people have to be symmetrical, definitely.
You're listening to Phil Burt, former head physiotherapist for British Cycling and the all-conquering Team Sky cycling team, on this an expert edition on all things cycling fundamentals and bike fit. If you missed last week's episode, it was a featured performer episode, and we really kept the British theme going. We featured current 2020 World Triathlon Series champion Georgia Taylor-Brown, sharing on her highs, lows, and learnings. She shared some terrific tips for female athletes and encouraged us to not lose sight of having fun along the way. To enjoy the full episode, be sure to jump back and search for episode 241, and whilst there, peruse the archives dating right back to episode 1 in 2016, featuring Surf Lifesaving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with this week's expert edition, brought to you by Endure IQ, Phil Burt on all things cycling fundamentals and bike fit.
Phil, couple of set questions. One piece of advice to help listeners perform at their best. If you could boil everything you've learnt and continuing to learn into one piece of advice, what would it be?
The one piece of advice I would give is, I think the ability to know when not to train is more important than when to train. So I think I've worked with some people who have been brilliant athletes. You never would have heard of them, had better numbers than some very famous people, but constantly broke down with illness and injury. It's those people. I think the ability to know when to back off is just as important, if not more important than when to push yourself. So I think that can be the key difference. Sometimes under-recovered is more of a problem than overtrained,
Yeah, gosh, and it makes me think of former featured expert of the show, Phil Shona Halson, who so often says the only training we're benefiting from is the training we're recovering from. Seems so obvious, right?
It is, but if you think about it, if you don't go out and train, you don't get any better, do you? So it is that horrible do as well. But if you can work it out and work out, I think it's custom to you. So if you some of those athletes you meet who just every winter they get cold at the same time, and they just do, well, why don't you change what you're doing? Why is that happening? And it can be really hard to work out. I think it's being honest with yourself, and just understanding your body. And maybe we all can't do it, but yeah, I'd agree completely. Shona, God, she knows that stuff, and she's saying it. Yeah, it's important.
Brilliant. Phil, every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So what is Phil Burt's physical challenge going to be?
Okay, so it needs to put a disclaimer with this one that I'm not responsible for any injuries or accidents with it, okay? Yeah. So I would challenge, can you cycle, no hands? The reason why I asked that is a good balanced position should always really, they say, you should be able to cycle it with no hands. And so it's one of those things that, obviously I don't want people to go and hurt themselves. Maybe they can do it. But if you have a look on YouTube, guys, there's a really famous video of a guy, and he's a little bit more portly than the average cyclist. You've got a bit of a beer belly in America, I think Texas somewhere, and he does no hand cycling on rollers, and he unclips and does it one-legged, and that to me is the definition of cycling core. Now, I'm not suggesting your listeners do that, but if you can go on your bike, see if you can ride no hands.
That's a first, Phil, for the Physical Performance Show, and it may be the only one in the history of the show. So, but if you do take it on, we expect some selfies while you're on the bike. That's a joke, but no, some video evidence of this physical challenge. Phil, where can listeners find you and follow you? And one thing that, as you said at the start, you've innovated around is some online bike fits, and that's certainly something I personally want to invest in having you look at my setup. So where can the listeners go, follow you, find out more, Phil? Yeah,
so if you just go to the website philburtinnovation.com, and basically some information there. It mainly got born out of the pandemic lockdown that we had here, and I've learned a lot about that. And basically, just drop us an email with your inquiry, and we can come back to you. Basically, what we ask you to do is we get you to record 3 videos on a turbo, front, side, and back. Send through some history, what your goal of the bike fit, what your problem is, what you want to try and solve. And what we then do is book in a time with you, and we go for a 30-minute conversation. I was surprised how successful it was and how much people liked it. It obviously hasn't got the benefits of being face-to-face with all the objective measures we normally take. But I suppose the reason why it's working is that there'll be some very obvious things that we've talked about today, Brad, that I can see from that and talking to you, that you can make some changes remotely that will make a big difference to you, So it's not the full package, obviously, but it can be, maybe going 80% of the way there, the last 20% is the polishing. And it really, really works, and as you know, Brad, nearly always what I say is that patients tell you the problem when you're taking the history, and bike fitting is no different. So when people send through their goals and then you see what their setup is and certain things, it's nearly always in there, and we can hopefully, if we can guide you through that, which is the minefield of, well, what if I change that? What if I change that? We're offering that service remotely.
It's brilliant. And we'll link all this up in the show notes over at Pogo Physio. And also I'd encourage the listeners to subscribe to the YouTube channel. I've been enjoying working my way through the archives. Phil Burt, you are a treasure of expertise, and thank you for your contribution to the show, and certainly wish you all the best navigating your way out of this pandemic along with the rest of the world.
Thanks, Brad. And really, thanks for having me on. And I hope to all the listeners out there, stay safe, stay well, and if you cycle happily.
And without hands on the bars.
That's it. I remember, the disclaimer is in there.
Phil Burt, thank you.
Thank you.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show. And I trust and I know you enjoyed Phil Burt's share-ins. Personally, I took so much from it. Be sure to jump over to our social media pages, Instagram, Facebook, where you'll see our top 5 learn-ins. There were so many. Now, if you did enjoy Phil's share-ins, be sure to reach out, let anyone in your world know who would benefit from the many great tips that Phil shared. And be sure to follow Phil over on Instagram at Phil Burt, Innov, INNOV. Check out Phil's YouTube channel, Phil Burt Innovation. Perhaps pick up one of the books, and we'll have those linked up in the show notes. And of course, reach out to Phil if you need an online bike fit assessment performed. Heads up, we'll likely feature Phil for a Q&A episode sometime down the road as well. Now, of course, if you took on the physical challenge, perhaps someone took a photo of you or even the video of yourself, then you're most welcome to post it up on social media along with any podsies. That's a screenshot of the episode you're enjoying and tag in the show at Physical Performance Show. Our YouTube channel is up and running now, and we'll be including snippets from the interviews as well as the featured episodes there as well. And as mentioned throughout the show, we're so excited to have officially launched the Physical Performance Show's Learnings membership. It's a simple Patreon support for anyone that's interested, no obligation, $5 a month. Simply search the Physical Performance Show over at Patreon, and for a low fee of $5 a month, you can receive free access to our ongoing triennial live stream events. Normally ticketed at $49 per head, so a simple membership just makes sense. But of course, there's no pressure. These shows will continue to be outputted freely for coaches, practitioners, and athletes. Be sure to also check out the Endure IQ's awesome offer of $25 off one of their fantastic online courses for long course triathlon. Dr. Dan Plews knows his stuff. He featured on Expert Edition 213, and he's the current age group Hawaii Ironman World Triathlon Championship record setter with a blistering 8:24. Dan really knows his stuff, and he's ready to teach you as well. Jump over to endurieiq.com and redeem your $25 off code using the code BRADBEER. Massive thanks to the great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, Matthew Oldin on all things show graphic design, and of course, thank you to you for tuning in each and every week. Keep the ratings and reviews coming. They are always a whole lot of fun. We'll have our annual 2020 feedback survey coming up soon too. Now, talking about coming up next week on the Physical Performance Show, it's the end of British Month. We've featured Ollie Williamson, Senior Physiotherapist for British Triathlon across 2 Expert Editions, Georgia Taylor Brown on a Featured Performer episode, and now Phil Burt. So it's time to farewell the Brits as we jump over and catch up with the queen of ultra running, none other than US-based Camille Herron on next week's Featured Performer episode. And boy, oh boy, did Camille Herron deliver. What an insight, the highs, lows, and learnings from one of the sport's most iconic figures. Camille, by bio, briefly, is the Comrades champion, the 50K, 100K, 24-hour world champion, has 5 world records to her name, regularly beats the majority of males in ultra events. And she shares some fantastic tips around how to overcome bone stress injuries, pace and fuel yourself, optimize your recovery, and so much more. So be sure to be tuning in next week. Camille Herron, the queen of ultra running. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.